the coin toss between life and death. Sometimes fate does not require war, conspiracy, or an enemy. Sometimes the distance between life and death is no wider than a coin spinning in midair, heads or tails. A train or an airplane, returning to the arms of the person you love, or vanishing from this world forever. On the evening of the 16th of January, 1942, in Las Vegas, one of the most famous women in America, Carole Lombard, the highest paid actress in Hollywood, the queen of screwball comedy, and the wife of Clark Gable, stood before a decision that seemed small, yet would change history forever. Her mother and her husband's closest press agent both pleaded with her, nearly begged her to take the train back to Los Angeles. War was spreading across the American sky. Night flights had become dangerous. Accidents were happening more frequently. But Carole Lombard wanted to get home immediately, not out of convenience or exhaustion, but because a confrontation was waiting for her. A fractured marriage, a husband suspected of infidelity, and a truth she could not allow to pass for another day. The argument among the three grew tense. No one was willing to yield. And then, in a gesture that was both impulsive and deeply theatrical, perfectly true to Carole Lombard herself, she made a final proposal. A coin toss. Heads meant the plane. Tails meant the train. Carole had always believed she was lucky when she called heads. The coin struck the table. Heads. The decision was made. There was no turning back. Just 13 minutes after takeoff, the Douglas DC-3 of TWA Flight 3 slammed into a mountainside near the summit of Mount Potosi at nearly 185 miles per hour. All 22 people aboard were killed instantly. Among them were Carole Lombard, her mother, Elizabeth Peters, Clark Gable's representative, and 15 young U.S. Army pilots on their way to training facilities. There were no distress calls, no chance to correct the mistake. Only darkness, stone, and a fatal error in a compass. But to understand why Carole Lombard's death shocked the entire nation, why President Franklin D. Roosevelt called her the first woman to die in the defense of her country during World War II, and why Clark Gable would carry his wife's ruby earring with him on 5 combat missions over Nazi Germany, we must go back in time to a girl born into luxury, raised through rupture, and forged into the most dangerous woman in Hollywood comedy. Part 2, Born into Privilege, Forged by Loss. Jane Alice Peters was born on the 6th of October, 1908, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, into a world that should have guaranteed security for life. Her early years were surrounded by the quiet confidence of old money wealth that did not announce itself loudly, but moved silently through generations. Her father, Frederick Christian Peters, had built a successful fortune in the hardware business. Her mother, Elizabeth Bessie Knight Peters, came from one of Fort Wayne's most prominent families. Even further back, her lineage extended into the technological backbone of the modern world. Her grandfather had played a key role in financing the first transatlantic telegraph cable, a project that reshaped global communication. By every definition, Jane Alice Peters was born holding a winning hand. And then, just as quietly as that privilege had existed, it collapsed. In 1914, when Jane was still a child, her parents' marriage disintegrated. The separation did more than fracture a household, it dismantled an entire way of life. The wealth that once promised stability vanished with stunning speed. Elizabeth Peters, now a single mother with 3 children, made a decision that would define both her life and her daughter's. She left Indiana behind. With no husband, no financial safety net, and no guarantees, Elizabeth relocated her family to Los Angeles. It was a city still inventing itself, a place where ambition mattered more than pedigree, and survival depended on adaptability. This displacement did not produce a fragile or sheltered child. It produced a force. Jane Alice Peters did not grow into the delicate porcelain starlet Hollywood would later try to manufacture. She became a tomboy, ferociously physical, relentlessly competitive, and startlingly fearless. She ran faster than the boys. She jumped higher. She climbed trees, vaulted fences, and scraped her knees without apology. Her athleticism was not a hobby. It was a language. In a world where her security had been stripped away without warning, her body became her armor. Strength became instinct. Movement became control. This physical confidence would later evolve into something revolutionary, but at the time, it was simply how she survived. Her entry into film was not the result of stage school grooming or studio ambition. It happened by accident. At just 12 years old, while playing baseball in the street, she was noticed by director Alan Dwan. He cast her in the 1921 film A Perfect Crime. The opportunity was real, but the road that followed was anything but glamorous. For years, Jane hovered at the margins of Hollywood. Small roles, rejections, studios that signed her, then discarded her within months. The industry showed her little mercy and no loyalty. Then, just before her 19th birthday, catastrophe struck. A car accident shattered a windshield, sending glass into her face. The resulting scars threatened to end her career before it had truly begun. In an era when actresses were expected to embody flawless beauty, any imperfection could be a death sentence. But Jane did not disappear. She adapted. Instead of chasing prestige roles, she threw herself into work that most actresses openly despised, slapstick comedy. Between 1927 and 1929, she appeared in 18 short films for Max Sennett's Keystone Studios. These years would later be dismissed by studio publicity as insignificant. They were anything but. While others saw slapstick as degrading, Jane treated it as brutal training. Keystone demanded absolute physical precision. Timing was everything. Pain was real. Falls were not faked. Mistakes were punished immediately by laughter or silence. She learned how to make choreography look accidental, how to synchronize her entire body to a joke, how to weaponize awkwardness, vulnerability, and chaos into something magnetic. Most importantly, she learned how to command attention without asking for permission. In later interviews, she would call these years the true turning point of her career. Hollywood had not created Carole Lombard yet, but Jane Alice Peters was becoming unstoppable. Do you want me to continue with part 3? The birth of Carole Lombard, the reinvention of her identity, and the moment she conquers Hollywood on her own terms? Part 3. The woman who refused to play safe. By the early 1930 seconds, Jane Alice Peters understood a brutal truth about Hollywood. Talent alone was not enough. Beauty was disposable, and obedience was rewarded far more often than originality. So she did something radical. She erased herself. Jane Alice Peters became Carole Lombard not as an act of vanity, but as a strategic rebirth. The new name carried sharper edges, more rhythm, more modernity. It belonged to a woman who would not wait to be chosen. Yet even with a new identity, Hollywood remained indifferent. Paramount Pictures signed her, tested her, and nearly abandoned her. Early dramatic roles failed to ignite audiences. Studio executives quietly labeled her unreliable, a polite euphemism for unprofitable. Another actress would have softened herself, chased approval, or accepted ornamental roles designed to keep her visible but powerless. Carole Lombard did the opposite. She leaned into chaos. The years she spent at Max Sennett's Keystone Studios, years the industry dismissed as slapstick drudgery, had rewired her instincts. She understood something few others did. Comedy was not about charm. It was about commitment. When Howard Hawks cast her opposite John Barrymore in 20th Century in 1934, he did not want elegance. He wanted danger. Hawks famously told Lombard to stop acting comedy and start living it. When the script called for her character, Lily Garland, to kick Barrymore's Oscar Jaffe, Hawks demanded it be real. No simulation, no restraint. Lombard did not hesitate. She leaned back on the couch, launched her legs upward, and delivered a series of violent kicks directly into Barrymore's torso while screaming at full volume. The soundstage froze. Barrymore, one of the most revered Shakespearean actors of his generation, was momentarily stunned. The scene became legendary, not because it was outrageous, but because it was honest. In that moment, Carole Lombard redefined what female comedy could be. She was not decorative. She was not passive. She was a force of nature who used her body as an instrument of truth. 20th Century did more than revive her career. It ignited a revolution. A new cinematic language emerged, rapid-fire dialogue, social class inversion, romantic combat disguised as humor, female characters who fought, mocked, resisted, and dominated. The genre would later be named screwball comedy, but Carole Lombard was already its purest expression. Where others flirted with physicality, she mastered it. She fidgeted, paced, flailed, adjusted her clothing, and weaponized nervous energy into storytelling. Every movement conveyed inner turbulence. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was accidental. In 1936, her performance in My Man Godfrey crystallized her genius. As Irene Bullock, a wealthy socialite who appeared frivolous but concealed surprising emotional intelligence, Lombard achieved something rare. She made audiences laugh at privilege while still believing in her humanity. The Academy recognized it. It would be her only nomination. By 1937, Carole Lombard made another unprecedented decision. She walked away from the security of a studio contract and became an independent performer. In an industry built on control, this was an act of defiance. The gamble paid off spectacularly. Her income surged to $465,000 per year, more than 5 times the annual salary of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. She was not merely the highest paid actress in Hollywood. She was among the highest paid individuals in the entire United States. Yet Lombard refused to apologize for her success. At a time when the wealthy hid income and resented taxation, she spoke openly and provocatively about paying her share. "I get 13 cents on the dollar," she told reporters, "so I don't think I earn $1. I think I earn 13 cents, and that's fine with me." She framed taxation as civic duty, schools, infrastructure, collective responsibility. President Roosevelt noticed. He sent her a personal letter of commendation, praising her as a model American taxpayer, an extraordinary gesture that would soon carry far greater meaning. Because war was coming, and Carole Lombard was about to become more than a movie star. She was about to become a symbol. Do you want me to continue with part 4? Carole Lombard, Clark Gable, the illusion of the perfect marriage, and the betrayal that set everything in motion? Part 4, the perfect marriage that wasn't. To the public, Carole Lombard and Clark Gable were not merely married. They were a myth. Hollywood called them the perfect couple, the queen of screwball comedy, and the king of masculine charisma. Their romance felt inevitable, cinematic, ordained. When they married in 1939, the union was celebrated as proof that even the most powerful stars could still find something resembling normal happiness. Behind closed doors, the reality was far more fragile. By early 1942, the marriage was unraveling. Clark Gable was at the peak of his power, MGM's most valuable male star, protected by the studio system, insulated from consequence. Carole Lombard, meanwhile, was evolving in a different direction. She was becoming politically vocal, morally uncompromising, and increasingly impatient with illusions. The conflict had a name: Lana Turner. Turner was Gable's co-star in Somewhere I'll Find You, the film he was actively shooting. She spoke openly about the chemistry between them, describing it as electric, undeniable. For Lombard, these were not rumors whispered in tabloids. They were patterns she could see. She had seen them before. During the filming of Honky Tonk in 1941, Lombard's concern over Gable and Turner's closeness became so intense that she began appearing on set repeatedly. The tension grew unbearable. Turner eventually retreated to her trailer to avoid confrontation. By the 12th of January 1942, just 4 days before Lombard's fatal flight, the situation exploded. Biographers describe a vicious argument. Accusations were exchanged. Trust collapsed. The fight was not merely about infidelity. It was about power, neglect, and a growing ideological divide. Lombard was 33 years old and acutely aware of time. In an era that treated female fertility as a countdown clock, she was desperate to have a child. Years of marriage had passed without pregnancy. The fear that she might never become a mother weighed heavily on her. At the same time, she was deeply frustrated by Gable's refusal to meaningfully engage with the war effort. While she raised millions for national defense, he remained safely ensconced at MGM, protected from service by his status and his studio's interests. To Lombard, patriotism was not symbolic, it was active, physical, personal. The morning after the argument, on January 13, Carole Lombard left for Indiana to lead the first war bond drive of the conflict. Clark Gable did not come to the station to see her off. The absence was deliberate. It cut deeply. Lombard's response was as theatrical as it was brutal. Before leaving, she placed a naked mannequin in Gable's bed, a silent, humiliating message. This was what remained: an absence shaped like a body, a simulacrum of intimacy, stripped of warmth. She left knowing the marriage was balanced on a knife's edge. But she also left determined. The Indiana rally on January 15 exceeded every projection. Thousands of Hoosiers gathered at the State House to see their native daughter. Lombard refused to delegate connection. She personally handed receipts to bond purchasers, spoke to them face to face, shook hands for hours. By nightfall, the drive had raised over $2 million in a single day. Before going to bed, she sent Clark Gable a telegram that would later be described as haunting. "Pa, you better get into this army." She intended to return home immediately, not to reconcile, but to confront. She wanted to arrive while her moral authority was undeniable before the triumph faded, before momentum cooled. The original plan was to take the train, days of travel, time for distance, time for hesitation. Carole Lombard did not want time. She wanted resolution, and that urgency would soon collide with fate itself. Do you want me to continue with part 5? The war bond triumph, the coin toss, and the final decision that sealed her fate? Part 5, the coin toss that ended everything. The triumph in Indiana should have been the end of the story. It was not. On the 15th of January, 1942, Carole Lombard had achieved something no Hollywood star had ever done before. In a single day, she raised more than $2 million in war bond pledges, nearly $40 million in today's currency. Thousands of people had waited for hours, not for spectacle, but for proximity. They wanted to look her in the eyes, to shake her hand, to believe that sacrifice meant something. Exhausted but energized, Lombard knew one thing with absolute clarity. She had to get home. The war bond victory had given her moral authority. She intended to confront Clark Gable while that authority was still blazing before the momentum faded, before distance softened resolve. The longer she waited, the more control she would lose. The original plan was simple: train to Los Angeles. Days of travel, predictable, safe. Her mother, Elizabeth Peters, insisted on it. Elizabeth was a devout Bahani believer, deeply engaged with numerology and patterns. That evening, something unsettled her: the dates, the numbers, the feeling. Witnesses later recalled her telling her daughter repeatedly, "Carole, don't take that plane." Otto Winkler, Clark Gable's press agent and best man at their wedding, agreed. He, too, feared flying. Winkler believed he possessed a psychic sense of impending doom. Years earlier, he had become convinced he would die in a car accident, a belief that shaped his life into one of constant caution. To him, the plane represented unnecessary risk. The discussion became heated. Lombard argued urgency, the need to return immediately, the emotional stakes, the confrontation she could no longer postpone. Her mother argued instinct, fear, a sense that something was wrong. No one would yield. Finally, Carole Lombard reached for a solution that reflected her personality, perfectly decisive, theatrical, and rooted in luck. A coin toss. Heads, they would fly. Tails, they would take the train. It was almost playful, almost absurd. Lombard called heads. She always had. The coin spun, landed, heads. The decision was sealed. That evening, at 7 p.m., TWA Flight 3 departed Las Vegas, bound for Burbank. The aircraft was a Douglas DC-3, tail number NC-28382, carrying 19 passengers and a crew of 3. The cockpit was commanded by Captain Wayne C. Williams, a veteran pilot with over 12,000 hours of flight experience, including 3,500 on the DC-3 alone. Nothing about the crew suggested danger. Nothing about the aircraft suggested failure. But buried in paperwork was a fatal error. During flight planning, Williams and his co-pilot had filed a magnetic compass course of 218 degrees. The correct course was 210. 8 degrees in error, small enough to seem insignificant, yet large enough to redirect the aircraft toward rising terrain. Compounding the risk, wartime blackout regulations had extinguished navigational beacons that normally guided pilots through mountain passes. The night sky was moonless. The desert offered no visual reference, At approximately 7:20 p.m., just 13 minutes after takeoff, the DC-3 slammed into an almost vertical cliff face near the summit of Mount Potosi at roughly 8,000 feet. The aircraft was traveling at 185 miles per hour. Both engines were still at full power. The impact was instantaneous. All 22 people aboard were killed immediately: Carole Lombard, her mother Elizabeth Peters, Otto Winkler, and 15 young Army pilots who never reached their training facilities in California. There was no distress call, no survivors. Only silence, fire, and shattered metal on a mountainside. But the story did not end on that cliff. It had only begun to haunt the man waiting in Los Angeles. Do you want me to continue with part 6? Clark Gable's collapse, the ruby earring, and the grief that drove him into the skies over Nazi Germany? Part 6. Grief, guilt, and the sky over Germany. Clark Gable learned of the crash while standing on the MGM lot in Burbank. He was in the middle of filming Somewhere I'll Find You. The irony would later feel unbearable. The set was loud, efficient, indifferent to catastrophe. Then the message arrived. Confusion first, denial immediately after. Planes were late all the time. Mistakes happened. There had to be survivors. There were none. Gable flew to Las Vegas within hours. From there, he traveled toward Mount Potosi, climbing into a night that refused to offer answers. He waited with search parties through darkness and cold, drinking heavily, bargaining with fate for a miracle he already knew would not come. At dawn, the wreckage was reached. There was no ambiguity. The aircraft had struck stone at full power. No one could have lived. When confirmation was delivered, Clark Gable broke. He attempted to climb the mountain toward the debris, driven by a desperate need to reach the place where his wife had died. An MGM handler physically restrained him. Gable collapsed, panting, hollowed, reduced to something smaller than grief. Among the scattered wreckage, searchers found a single, intimate object, one of Carole Lombard's ruby and diamond earrings. Gable kept it. For the rest of his life, he wore that earring on a chain around his neck. President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued a declaration that reframed the tragedy for an entire nation. Carole Lombard, he said, was the first woman to be killed in action in the defense of her country during its war against the Axis powers. The Treasury Department echoed the sentiment. She had died for her country. 7 months later, on the 12th of August, 1942, Clark Gable walked into a U.S. Army Air Force's recruitment office and enlisted. He was 41 years old. President Roosevelt personally urged him to stay home, sending a telegram that read simply, "Stay where you are." Gable refused. Biographers would later note that he made no effort to conceal his indifference toward survival. Whether this was patriotism, punishment, or a desire for reunion was never clarified. He trained as an aerial gunner. He flew 5 combat missions over Nazi Germany aboard B-17 Flying Fortresses. Beneath his flight suit, against his chest, rested Carole Lombard's ruby earring. On the 12th of August, 1943, exactly 1 year after his enlistment, a 20-millimeter cannon shell fired by a German Messerschmitt tore through his aircraft's flight deck. It passed so close to Gable that it sheared off the heel of his shoe. An infinitesimal difference in trajectory would have ended his life. It did not. Clark Gable survived the war, but he never recovered. When he died in November 1960, 18 years after Carole Lombard, his will contained a single, unambiguous instruction. He was to be buried beside her at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, not with his second or third wife, but with the woman whose earring had rested against his heart during 5 missions over enemy territory. The woman lost to a coin toss. The woman whose final telegram pushed him into a war he would enter, seeking either redemption through sacrifice or reunion through death. Fate had reduced everything to chance, heads or tails, and history had chosen. Do you want me to continue with part 7? The legacy, the myth, and why Carole Lombard still haunts American memory today? Part 7. The legacy of a woman chosen by chance. Carole Lombard did not live long enough to see the world she helped shape. She did not see the end of the war. She did not see the transformation of Hollywood. She did not see how the genre she embodied would redefine female agency on screen for generations, but her absence became its own presence. In the months following her death, Carole Lombard ceased to be only an actress. She became a symbol of sacrifice, of patriotism, of a woman who did not treat fame as insulation from responsibility. America did not mourn her quietly. It mourned her collectively. Newspapers framed her death not as an accident, but as a consequence of commitment, a life interrupted because she chose to act rather than observe, to participate rather than remain protected. Her image was frozen in time, youthful, fearless, laughing on screen, while the country she loved descended fully into global war. For many Americans, Lombard became proof that the cost of war was not abstract. It had a face, a voice, a future erased by 8 degrees on a compass. In Hollywood, her influence endured in less visible ways. The women who followed actresses who spoke faster, moved bolder, resisted passivity were inheritors of a language Carole Lombard had helped invent. Screwball comedy did not merely entertain. It challenged hierarchies. It allowed women to dominate scenes physically and verbally without apology. That legacy would echo for decades. Clark Gable never publicly recovered from her loss. Though he remarried and continued working, those close to him noted a permanent hardening, a gravity that never lifted. The ruby earring remained against his chest until the day he died, a private relic of grief carried beneath public legend. When he was buried beside her at Forest Lawn, it closed a circle history had left open for 18 years. 2 stars, 1 coin toss, a marriage fractured, then sealed forever by fate. Carole Lombard's story endures because it resists comfort. It reminds us that chance can outweigh intention, that love and betrayal can coexist, that heroism can emerge not from battlefields alone, but from decisions made in exhaustion, urgency, and faith in luck. She did not die because she was careless. She died because she was determined, and that is why, decades later, her story still asks us the same unsettling question. If you knew how fragile the margin was, would you still call heads? And the woman behind the crown. August do Mizeche. The Caribbean sun was not just scorching. In a law office in Street Lucia, a noble woman sat upright, silent, her hands resting on her knees, as a lifelong habit. She was Lady Anne Glenconner, the woman behind hundreds of royal photographs, carrying bags, holding scarves, taking care of everything for Princess Margaret. She was also one of the people who helped build the luxurious Moustique, where the elite, rock stars, and media once went wild for its half-real, half-legendary parties. But that day, she wasn't there for a party. She was there to hear her husband's will and to witness the final, most cruel blow when the lawyer read, "I leave everything to Kent Adonai." Her husband's trusted butler, the air in the room seemed to be sucked dry. Not because of the money, but because of the message, she was being erased. Not a share for her, not a share for her children. After 54 years of marriage, she was not only stripped of her property, but also of her role as a family woman. And if you think this is the end of a tragedy, no. This is just the final curtain closing on a play in which, for the first half of her life, she lived as an unwilling actress, born into luxury, but raised in the cold. Anne, whose birth name was Anne Veronica Koch, was born on the 16th of July, 1932, in South Kensington, London, and grew up on Holcombe Hall Estate in Norfolk, a place breathtakingly beautiful, yet suffocatingly cold. In that world, love wasn't expressed through hugs and kisses. It was expressed through discipline. She grew up with unspoken rules. No complaining, no making noise, no making others uncomfortable, and especially, never let emotions spoil a room. That armor helped her survive later on. But it also made her someone who could endure for too long. In 1953, when the whole of England held its breath before the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, Anne, then very young, was chosen as one of the maids of honor at the coronation ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Imagine, a girl walking amidst the oldest rituals of the monarchy, bearing the gaze of history. And at that moment, everyone thought her life had reached its peak. Prestige, fame, admiration. But sometimes, the peak is where the wind is strongest. The man who promised freedom and delivered a sentence In 1956, Anne married Colin Tennant, who later became Lord Glenconner. Colin possessed a charm that typical aristocratic men lacked: bold, intelligent, worldly, and seemingly capable of freeing her from the stifling atmosphere of Holcombe. But some men shine in a dangerous way. They shine so you don't see the darkness behind them. Anne's marriage didn't open up freedom. It opened up a life of anticipating the other person's mood hour by hour. A life where an ill-timed word, an unsatisfactory meal, an inappropriate silence could turn into a storm. And Anne taught don't spoil the room, chose silence. Not because she was weak, but because she had been trained to believe that endurance was the quality of a proper woman. Moustique, a paradise for others, her battlefield. In 1958, Colin bought the island of Moustique in the Grenadines for £45,000, a place that was then almost untouched. In a move that was both ostentatious and calculated, he gifted a piece of land on the island to Princess Margaret as a wedding present. In 1960, Margaret visited Moustique on her Caribbean honeymoon, later building the famous Les Jolies Eaux holiday villa, and from that moment, Moustique's fortune changed. Wherever the princess set foot, the elite would flock. People spoke of Moustique as a postcard: blue sea, white sand, secrecy, and parties out of this world. But for Anne, Moustique wasn't a postcard. It was the behind the scenes. She was the one who took care of the water, the food, the schedules, the privacy, and most importantly, her husband's wrath, so that powerful guests could still smile as if nothing had happened. There's a strange kind of hell. You stand in paradise, but you're not allowed to enjoy it. You're only allowed to operate it. Princess Margaret and the lady-in-waiting role. From 1971, Anne became the lady-in-waiting for Princess Margaret and remained with her until Margaret's death in 2002. It sounds glamorous, but the nature of the job was a combination: secretary, housekeeper, companion, temper tolerator, and sometimes an unlicensed therapist. Margaret was sharp, charming, but could also be difficult and harsh. And Anne did what she did best: maintain order for others, even when her own life was falling apart. Off camera, she was the woman carrying the princess's bag. But behind the scenes, she was learning to hold herself so as not to fall apart. And then, while the world only saw the parties of the super rich, royal love stories, tabloid headlines, in Anne's house, a curse began to descend. Not just once, but repeatedly. The mother of the doomed, the smile that hid the funerals. To the public, Anne Glenconner was the woman in the background of royal photographs. Calm, poised, useful, the one who made everything look effortless. The perfect picnic, the perfectly timed drink, the perfectly packed schedule. But that public image was a mask. Polished, practiced, almost surgical. Because while cameras chased the glamour of Princess Margaret's circle, Anne was living a private story so brutal it feels unreal. She was losing her children, one by one, while still showing up the next morning as if nothing had happened. And that is the particular cruelty of her world. Not that tragedy arrived. Tragedy visits everyone. But that she was trained to swallow it whole and keep the room comfortable. For other people, Charlie the heir, who began to disappear. The collapse started with Charlie, the eldest son. Handsome, charming, the boy who was supposed to carry the title forward and redeem what his father had broken. Anne wanted to believe Charlie would be the correction, the clean rewrite, the proof that this family could still become something gentle. But in the 1,970 seconds, when heroin began creeping through certain high society circles, like a fashionable plague, Charlie was pulled in, not slowly, not politely, violently. For Anne, it wasn't one dramatic moment. It was the long torture of watching someone you love fade in inches. He'd vanish for days. He'd return thinner, stranger, more hollow-eyed. He'd promise. He'd collapse. He'd promise again. She did what mothers do when money and status give them options. She tried clinics, specialists, private help, anything that might pull him back. But addiction is not impressed by family names. And Charlie's fate, as the story goes, wasn't only the drug. It was what the drug left behind. The damage, the infections, the slow poisoning that kept writing itself into his body long after the highs were gone. When Charlie died in 1996, Anne buried her firstborn. And what makes it colder, what makes it truly gothic, is the sense that Colin, the father, did not break in the way a father should. In this household, grief wasn't shared. It was managed. Anne was the manager. Henry, the secret that ate her alive. If Charlie's tragedy had ripples the outside world could sense, Henry's was different. Henry was described as the gentler one, sensitive, artistic, tender, everything his father wasn't. And in the late 1,980 seconds, he told Anne something that, in that era, carried not only fear, but stigma sharp enough to destroy reputations. Henry was HIV positive. Today, people speak about HIV with far more understanding. But then, it came wrapped in panic, judgment, and social exile, especially in elite circles, where appearances were treated like oxygen. So Anne did what her entire upbringing had trained her to do. She turned pain into silence. She became Henry's private nurse. She watched him weaken. She watched illness rewrite his body. And then, when she had to, she watched him die. And here is the detail that turns the knife. Henry died on the morning of Charlie's wedding in 1990. Imagine the impossible choreography of that day. A mother closes her son's eyes in one room, then walks into another room to put on a hat, arrange hair face, and attend a wedding, as if her chest isn't splitting open. Not because she didn't love him, because she lived inside a system that demanded, don't ruin the day, don't ruin the room, don't ruin the story. So she lied to protect the scene. She said Henry was unwell. She smiled at guests. She sang hymns in church while her son's body lay behind her, like an unspeakable truth. That is not strength. In the movie hero sense, that is the strength of a person who has been trained to survive by becoming almost unreal. And then there's Colin's reaction. So brutal. It becomes a sentence you can't forget. When Henry disclosed his illness, Colin's response wasn't comfort. It was disgusted calculation. Well, you'd better not come to Mystique then. You'll scare the guests. In one line, he revealed the hierarchy of his soul. Guests first, image first, paradise first, even above his child. Anne absorbed that too, not because it didn't hurt, but because she had no choice, except to keep functioning. Christopher, the son, who returned as a stranger. And still, fate wasn't finished. Christopher, the third son, suffered a catastrophic motorcycle accident, an injury so severe it put him in a coma, suspended between life and death. Once again, Anne found herself beside a hospital bed, speaking into silence, bargaining with the universe like mothers do when there is nothing else left to bargain with. Christopher woke up, but not unchanged. He lived, yet the person he had been was altered. Permanent disability, a different temperament, a life that would require constant care, a kind of loss that doesn't end with a funeral because it continues every day. So if Anne buried two sons, she also mourned a third in a different way, as a living absence. And that is a grief people rarely talk about. When someone survives, but the version you knew does not. Two lives in one body. Now picture the timeline of Anne's existence. In one world, she is lady in waiting, organizing schedules, smoothing crises, making royal life look seamless. In the other, she is a mother, carrying a private cemetery in her chest. She later distilled it into a line that hits like a quiet explosion. I wiped the princess's tears, but nobody wiped mine. It isn't a plea for pity. It's a report from inside a life where her job was to hold everyone else together, even when her own family was shattering. And in a strange, tragic way, the work became her anesthetic. The routines, the duties, the constant next task, anything to keep her from being alone in a room where grief could finally speak. By the time Princess Margaret's health began to decline, strokes, accidents, fading sight, Anne was already exhausted, already hollowed out by years of private mourning. And then, when Margaret died in 2002, Anne didn't just lose a royal she served, she lost the one constant structure that had kept her upright, which meant there was nothing left. Between her and the next chapter of the nightmare, Colin's final years, Saint Lucia, the manservant Kent, and the will that erased her, the man who rewrote the ending after the princess returning to the dragon. When Princess Margaret died in 2002, something fundamental collapsed in Anne Glenconner's life. For over 3 decades, service had given her structure. It had given her a reason to get up, to dress properly, to keep moving forward. Even while grief stalked her like a shadow, Margaret's death didn't just end a job. It removed the last wall, standing between Anne and the man she had spent a lifetime surviving, Colin. By then, the marriage was no longer a relationship. It was an arrangement of distance and endurance. They lived parallel lives, orbiting each other, without intimacy, without honesty, without peace. Colin had sold Mustic, claiming boredom. But in truth, the island had changed. The anarchic playground of the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds had hardened into something corporate, gated, and sterilely. The wild kingdom no longer reflected him, so he moved on to St. Lucia, to a decaying colonial estate called Beau Estate, and to a final act of self-mythologizing. Madness refined. In St. Lucia, Colin's eccentricity stopped being charming and became absolute. He bought an elephant, a real one. He wandered the jungle like a self-appointed monarch. He surrounded himself with servants and fantasies. And then there was Kent Adonai. Kent was local, loyal, attentive, everything Colin wanted in a companion at that stage of his life, where his biological sons had disappointed him by being human, fragile, complex, needy. Kent asked for nothing except approval. Colin dressed him, promoted him, paraded him. Gradually, subtly, he replaced his family with him. Anne watched this happen from a distance, living in a separate house on the same estate. Polite, civil, emotionally absent, they were still married on paper, but the marriage had been dead for years. She told herself, one thing kept the situation tolerable. At least, when he dies, the estate will pass to Christopher and the grandchildren. That was the final illusion, the will. In 2010, Colin Tennant died of cancer. Anne stood by his side at the end because that is what she had always done. She attended the funeral. She played the grieving widow perfectly. Decades of training made grief look dignified. Then came the lawyer's office and the sentence that erased her. Colin left everything, the estate, the assets, the remaining wealth, to Kent Adonai. Not a portion, not a compromise. Everything. In one final act, Colin achieved what he always craved: absolute control. Even in death, he forced Anne to react. He guaranteed scandal. He guaranteed pain. But here is where the story turns. The refusal, the world expected a courtroom drama. They expected Anne to fight, to scream, to demand justice, to drag the family secrets into the sunlight and turn the final chapter into a public bloodbath. She did none of that. Anne looked at the reality with brutal clarity. A legal battle would take years. It would cost money she didn't have. It would keep her trapped in St. Lucia, fighting a ghost who still wanted her attention. And she understood something crucial. The inheritance wasn't the trap. Bitterness was. So she walked away. She left the estate, left the elephant, left the jungle, left the man who had tried to destroy her from beyond the grave. She boarded a plane back to England with dignity intact and almost nothing else. And in that moment, at nearly 80 years old, Anne Glenconner did something she had never done before. She chose herself. A smaller house, a larger life. Back in Norfolk, Anne didn't return to Holkham Hall. That belonged to the next generation. Instead, she moved into a modest farmhouse, quiet, ordinary, almost anonymous by aristocratic standards. And for the first time in her life, silence felt safe. She had her dogs, her garden, her memories, no longer managed, no longer hidden. But peace does not erase trauma. It only gives it room to speak. And as the years passed, Anne realized something else. If she didn't tell her story, someone else would. And they would get it wrong. The pen. At 87 years old, Anne decided to write, not to complain, not to seek revenge, but to set the record straight. The book was called Lady in Waiting. She didn't soften the violence. She didn't dramatize the suffering. She wrote with dry wit, restraint, and a devastating calm that made the horror land even harder. When the memoir was published in 2019, it exploded. The world didn't just read it, they listened. Anne Glenconner, once invisible, became the voice of an entire generation of women who had been trained to endure quietly while men detonated lives around them. And the irony was perfect. Colin had disinherited her to erase her, but his cruelty became the raw material that finally set her free. Fame came late. Independence followed. And with it came something Anne had never truly possessed before, her own story. But the story doesn't end in success. It ends in meaning. In the next part, we will explore Anne's ultimate transformation, how she re-examines the abuse without becoming bitter, how she becomes a cultural witness to a vanished aristocratic world, and why her story is not a tragedy, but a second chapter. The second act, becoming visible at last. When Lady in Waiting reached readers, something quietly radical happened. For the first time, Anne Glenconner was no longer known, primarily as someone else's appendage, not the wife of Lord Glenconner, not the lady in waiting to Princess Margaret, not the elegant woman hovering just out of frame. She was Anne. Audiences expected a fragile, aristocratic widow, perhaps apologetic, perhaps mournful. Instead, they met a woman in her late 80s with razor-sharp timing, dry humor, and an almost alarming, emotional clarity. When she spoke about abuse, she didn't whisper. When she spoke about grief, she didn't collapse. And when she spoke about Colin, she didn't rage. That refusal to perform bitterness disarmed everyone, reclaiming trauma without letting it define her. There is a moment, often quoted, when Anne is asked if she hated her husband. Her answer always surprised people. No, I don't hate him. He was extraordinary. I wouldn't have missed it. This is not denial, and it is not forgiveness. In the sentimental sense, it is something far more unsettling and far more powerful. Anne does not frame her life as victimhood. She frames it as experience, a brutal, excessive, sometimes grotesque adventure, but hers nonetheless. Colin, in her telling, is not a misunderstood genius or a pure villain. He is a force of chaos, a dragon she had to live with, and without that dragon, she believed she would never have discovered her own endurance. She refused to reduce her life to suffering because that would still give him control. The generation she spoke for, what made Anne's story resonate so deeply, wasn't just its drama, it was its recognition. Women of her class and era were raised to be shock absorbers, to keep things running, to maintain appearances, to make discomfort disappear. For others, they were not trained to ask whether the cost was survivable. Anne articulated what many had lived, but never named. That elegance often came wrapped around silence and silence around pain. Her memoir cracked that shell, not loudly, but unmistakably. The last witness in her final decades, Anne became something unexpected, a historical key. When writers and actors sought to understand Princess Margaret beyond caricature, they came to Anne. She had been there, not for the public performances, but for the 3 a.m. silences, the cigarettes, the ice in the glass, the loneliness. She corrected scripts, added texture, restored humanity for a woman. Once trained to disappear, it was a quiet reversal of power. She became the custodian of truth, loss that never shrinks. Success did not erase grief. Anne was honest about this too. She said grief doesn't get smaller. You grow around it. Some days, it weighs nothing. Other days, it pulls you under. She lived with the absence of Charlie, with the quiet gentleness of Henry that never aged, with Christopher's altered presence, love mixed with mourning. And yet, she did not turn away from the photographs. She looked at them every day, not as wounds, but as proof of love. The final reframing. In the end, Anne Glenconner's story subverts the expected arc. She was supposed to fade, to become a footnote, to be remembered only as a woman who lost everything. Instead, she became something else entirely. A woman who proved that dignity is not pretending nothing happened. It is refusing to let what happened turn you cruel, small, or bitter. Colin left the money to the manservant. Anne kept the story. And in the long run, the story was worth more. The closing image. Today, Anne sits in the English countryside, far from the heat of Moustic, far from the chaos of palaces and parties. She is alone, but not lonely, surrounded by memories, but not ruled by them. She pours herself a drink, perhaps a gin and tonic, for old time's sake, and raises it not to the past, but to the quiet. The servant has left the waiting room. The woman has taken her seat. And for the first time, the world is listening. The silence that wins. The woman who outlived the story. By the time Anne Glenconner entered her 90s, the world had changed, almost beyond recognition. The rigid hierarchies of her childhood had softened. The monarchy she once served had been reshaped by scandal, divorce, and public scrutiny. And the aristocratic code of silence, the one she had lived inside for decades, was finally cracking. Yet Anne remained, not frozen in nostalgia, not bitter about what was lost, but astonishingly present. She attended literary festivals, sat on television sofas, answered questions younger interviewers barely knew how to ask. And every time, she refused to perform fragility. She spoke with humor, with clarity, with the calm authority of someone who had already survived the worst thing imaginable and discovered it hadn't destroyed her. Why Colin truly lost? Colin Tennant believed in spectacle, in domination, in the power of the final gesture. He thought disinheritance would be the ultimate humiliation. That leaving Anne with nothing would shrink her. That history would remember him as the man who had the last word. But Colin misunderstood something fundamental. Money disappears. Property changes hands. Power fades. Stories do not. By refusing to fight him in court, Anne denied him the final performance he craved. She didn't rage. She didn't beg. She didn't collapse. She simply stepped out of the arena. And in doing so, she stripped his last act of meaning, the quiet power of choice. Anne often said she didn't feel brave. That word, she believed, belonged to people who had alternatives. She endured because endurance was required. She survived because stopping wasn't an option. And yet, looking back, one choice stands apart from all the others. She chose not to be bitter. That decision, quiet, private, uncelebrated, was the most radical act of her life. Bitterness would have kept her tied to Colin forever. Anger would have extended his control beyond the grave. Instead, Anne chose lightness, humor, perspective, not because the past was harmless, but because she refused to let it poison the future, the final image. Imagine her now, a farmhouse in Norfolk, soft daylight through English rain, a garden that needs tending, no palace schedules, no tempers to manage, no roles to play, just a woman who has finally stepped into her own life, late, battered, but intact. She has buried children, outlived a princess, survived a man who tried to erase her. And what remains is not tragedy, it is clarity. The meaning of her story, Lady Anne Glenconner's life, teaches us something uncomfortable and essential. You can lose your youth, your wealth, your family, even your place in the world. And still, if you keep your humor, your spine straight, and your sense of self, you are not defeated. She was raised to be decoration, trained to be silent, designed to serve. Instead, she became a witness. And witnesses, in the end, are more powerful than kings. Final close. History often celebrates victors, but the stories that endure are told by survivors. Lady Anne Glenconner was never meant to be the headline. She was meant to stand 2 steps behind it. Instead, she outlived the story and claimed it as her own. The servant has left the waiting room. The woman has taken her seat, and the silence is the standing ovation. Part 1. The silence of old money. There is a particular coldness that belongs only to America's old money. It does not shout, it does not glitter, it does not announce itself. It waits. It settles into marble corridors and manicured hedges. It lingers in rooms where generations have learned that power does not need noise to be felt. Doris Duke was born into that silence. Her fortune did not simply buy comfort or status. It shaped institutions, redirected economies, and rewrote the social order of an entire region. The Duke name did not merely influence America. It engineered it. From the moment she entered the world on November 22nd, 1912, Doris Duke was no longer just a child. Newspapers crowned her the richest little girl in the world before she could speak, Wealth became her identity long before she could understand what it cost. Her father, James Buchanan Buck Duke, was the architect of that wealth. A man forged by post-Civil War devastation, Buck Duke built an empire from the ashes of ruin. His own father, Washington Duke, returned home from a Union prison camp in 1865 to find his farm destroyed by Sherman's armies. All that remained were 50 cents and a small bag of forgotten tobacco leaves. From a 16 by 8-foot log shed, the Duke family began rolling and selling tobacco by hand. Buck Duke saw something others did not. He understood that the future belonged to machines. In 1885, he acquired James Bonsack's cigarette rolling machine, capable of producing 120,000 cigarettes a day. Competitors clung to tradition. Duke embraced scale. Within 5 years, he controlled 40% of the American cigarette market. In 1890, the American Tobacco Company was born. Addiction became industry. Power became permanent. When the United States Supreme Court dissolved American Tobacco in 1911 for violating antitrust laws, Buck Duke had already moved on. He redirected his fortune into hydroelectric power, creating what would become Duke Power. His wealth survived. His influence expanded. Buck Duke had only one vulnerability: his daughter. When he married Nanaline Holt Inman, her social ambition reshaped the family's lifestyle. They purchased Rough Point in Newport, Rhode Island, overlooking the Atlantic cliffs. A ballroom was added specifically for Doris's future debut. Every detail of her life was planned, curated, and controlled. Doris did not grow up among other children. She grew up among servants, chauffeurs, bodyguards, private tutors, nurses. Her world was insulated, protected, and profoundly lonely. She was not raised to trust. She was raised to observe. On October 10th, 1925, Buck Duke died in his Fifth Avenue mansion. Doris was 13 years old. His will left $17 million to the Duke endowment and between $60 and $100 million to his wife and daughter. Doris Duke became one of the wealthiest children on earth. Along with the money, Buck left his daughter a warning: trust no one. After his death, Doris discovered bags of hidden correspondence, death threats, kidnapping demands, marriage proposals, letters filled with rage, all addressed to her fortune rather than her humanity. She learned early that wealth distorted every human interaction. Love could be purchased, loyalty could be rented, betrayal was always waiting. She inherited 5 major estates: Duke Farms in New Jersey, Rough Point in Newport, a Fifth Avenue mansion in New York, Falcon Lair in Beverly Hills, later Shangri-La in Hawaii. Each became a fortress, not against poverty, but against people. In 1930, during the depths of the Great Depression, 600 guests arrived at Rough Point for Doris Duke's debutante ball. As breadlines stretched across the nation, chandeliers blazed and champagne flowed. The contrast was staggering. Doris did not dance. She watched, she observed, she learned. From the very beginning, Doris Duke understood one truth that would shape the rest of her life. Money could buy anything except certainty, and the silence that surrounded her was not protection. It was a warning. Part 2. A life staged in gold and doubt. Doris Duke entered society during one of the cruelest ironies of American history. In 1930, as breadlines stretched across cities and families slept in doorways, Rough Point blazed with light. 600 guests arrived in silk and diamonds for Doris Duke's debutante ball, dancing beneath chandeliers built specifically for her coming out into society. She did not even dance that night. A tennis injury kept Doris sidelined, watching instead as others celebrated a future she did not yet trust. At her side stood James Cromwell, divorced and 16 years older, a man who would later become her first husband. Even then, she sensed the pattern that would follow her all her life. After I have gone out with a man a few times, Doris would later tell reporters, he begins to tell me how much he loves me. But how can I know if he really means it? How can I ever be sure? Money had made love suspicious. Her marriages followed a familiar rhythm: sudden intensity, rapid commitment, slow disillusionment. Each ended with the same quiet realization that affection in her world was inseparable from access to her wealth. Husbands came and went, but the estates remained. The servants remained. The silence remained. By the late 1950 seconds, Doris Duke had retreated deeper into control. She collected art, architecture, history, and people. Nothing entered her world without approval. Nothing left easily. That was when Eduardo Torella arrived. A decorated World War II veteran with a Bronze Star, Torella had reinvented himself as a Hollywood set designer. He understood illusion, atmosphere, and beauty. Doris hired him in 1959 and paid him $43,000 a year, a staggering sum at the time. More than a salary, it was an arrangement of dependency. Torella designed rooms, curated collections, and shaped the visual identity of all 5 Duke estates. Doris reorganized her living spaces so that he would always be nearby, always available. His taste became her taste. His presence became essential. 7 years passed this way, but by 1966, Torella wanted out. Hollywood called again. Creative freedom beckoned. Decorating an heiress's endless homes had begun to feel like a gilded cage of its own. Friends warned him that Doris Duke did not handle abandonment well. They were right. On the morning of the 7th of October, 1966, at Rough Point, Torella told Doris Duke that he was leaving permanently. Servants later said her fury echoed through the mansion. Accusations flew. Her voice sharpened. Torella remained calm, professional, resolute. Years earlier, according to police reports, Doris had allegedly stabbed a former lover with a butcher knife during a breakup. No charges were filed, but the pattern of rage at rejection had already been documented. By late afternoon, the argument seemed to end. Doris suddenly mentioned a religious artifact at the Black Cat Antique Shop, a 15th century reliquary containing the bones of a martyr. She needed Torella's professional judgment one last time, she said. One final favor. A Dodge Polara station wagon had been rented, ostensibly to transport Torella's belongings. It was a heavy vehicle with power steering and automatic transmission, easy to accelerate, difficult to stop quickly. At approximately 5:25 in the evening, they drove toward the gates of Rough Point, Eduardo Torella at the wheel, Doris Duke in the passenger seat. The wrought iron gates were locked, as always. Torella stopped 12 to 15 feet before them, shifted into park, pulled the parking brake, and stepped out to unlock the gates. Doris remained inside. She always had. Until that evening. Do you want me to continue to part 3, where eyewitnesses, forensic evidence, and police conduct collide at the gates of Rough Point, or would you like adjustments before proceeding? Part 3, the gates of Rough Point. What happened next would be described for decades as an accident. But on the evening of the 7th of October, 1966, the scene unfolding at the gates of Rough Point did not resemble chance. It resembled chaos, force, and something far more deliberate. As Eduardo Torella stepped out of the Dodge Polara and walked toward the wrought iron gates, the engine behind him continued to idle. The vehicle had not stalled. It had not rolled. According to Doris Duke herself, this was a routine she had witnessed hundreds of times. He would unlock the gates, she would wait. But that routine broke. 13-year-old Bob Walker was riding his bicycle along Ledge Road, delivering newspapers for the Newport Daily News. As he passed the Duke estate, he heard raised voices, an argument, then silence. Only a few seconds passed before another sound cut through the air. The roar of an engine? According to the police theory formed that night, Doris Duke shifted across the bench seat from passenger to driver. She released the parking brake. She moved the transmission into drive. And she pressed the accelerator. The Dodge Polara surged forward. Witnesses and physical evidence suggested that Torella was struck with enough force to lift him onto the hood as the vehicle smashed through the iron gates. Blood and tissue would later be found not at the gate itself, but in the center of Bellevue Avenue, indicating where his body actually fell. Bob Walker reported hearing brakes applied briefly at the moment of impact, a deceleration, then another burst of acceleration. He later described hearing screaming as the car moved again. The station wagon ran over Eduardo Torella's body, dragging him across the pavement before crashing through 20 feet of fencing at the neighboring Quatrell estate and finally slamming into a tree. Officer Edward Angel arrived minutes later to find Doris Duke crying out, repeating the words, "My friend, my friend." Eduardo Torella lay crushed beneath the rear axle of the vehicle. Paramedic Judith Tom Wortko arrived first on scene. She would later testify that Doris appeared hysterical but only had minor scratches on her face, no heavy bleeding, no severe trauma. This detail would later become critical. Bob Walker approached the scene, offering help. According to his testimony, Doris Duke screamed at him to get away. Each attempt he made to assist was met with increasing hostility until he fled, frightened. That night, Walker tried to tell his father what he had seen. His father stopped him immediately. He warned his son that Doris Duke was dangerous, surrounded by people who could make problems disappear. The message was clear: silence was safer. Walker would keep that silence for 55 years. At the scene, Sergeant Fred Newton examined the physical evidence. Tire gouges in the gravel suggested extreme acceleration, not an accidental roll. Gate markings indicated a body had been forced upward, consistent with hood impact. The autopsy performed by Dr. James Flanagan the following day revealed catastrophic injuries: multiple skull fractures, massive brain hemorrhage, a crushed torso, broken sternum and ribs, a complete spinal cord tear. Yet Torella's legs were largely intact. Forensic experts later noted that if he had been pinned between the vehicle and the iron gates, his legs would likely have been pulverized. Instead, the injury pattern suggested he had been struck at speed, lifted onto the hood, then run over after falling. To move the Dodge Polara from its parked position required 4 deliberate actions: releasing the parking brake, shifting gears, removing pressure from the brake pedal, accelerating. Each action required conscious intent. Yet within days, the narrative would change. Do you want Part 4, when the investigation stopped? In the hours after Eduardo Torella's death, the case did not unfold like a typical vehicular homicide investigation. Procedures that were routine for ordinary citizens seemed optional when applied to Doris Duke. Chief Joseph Radis of the Newport Police Department personally took control of the scene. Instead of separating Doris Duke as a potential suspect, officers escorted her arm in arm back into Rough Point. No immediate formal interrogation took place. No sobriety test was administered. No toxicology screen was ordered. The first 48 hours passed in near silence. Assistant Medical Examiner Dr. Philip Mallister made a decision that would later draw intense criticism. While still responsible for evaluating the cause of death, he agreed to serve as Doris Duke's personal physician. Duke was placed in a private hospital room, effectively shielding her from questioning by state authorities. Mallister told reporters that it was unthinkable to consider anything other than an accident. He claimed Doris Duke had suffered serious facial injuries requiring extensive medical treatment. This directly contradicted what paramedic Judith Tom Wortko had observed at the scene. She reported only minor scratches, no visible bleeding, no injuries consistent with the 30 facial stitches later claimed. Despite the violent nature of the death, Newport police did not conduct a thorough reconstruction. The vehicle was not impounded for extensive testing. Witnesses were not immediately re-interviewed. The boy who had been present, Bob Walker, was not formally questioned. 2 days later, on October 9th, police finally interviewed Doris Duke. She remained in her bedroom at Rough Point, surrounded by attorneys and German shepherds. Lieutenant Frank Walsh and Detective George Watts asked only 4 questions. The entire exchange lasted minutes. By October 12th, just 5 days after the death, Chief Radis publicly declared the case closed. The official conclusion was an unfortunate accident with no evidence of criminal intent. Not everyone agreed. Rhode Island Attorney General Joseph Nugent privately expressed concern about the speed and scope of the investigation. Newport attorney William O'Connell would later claim that pressure from state officials forced Radis to revisit documentation after the fact. According to O'Connell, Doris Duke's attorney, Aram Arabian, suggested drafting a written statement for Duke to sign. The resulting 3-page transcript appeared to have been created retroactively rather than during a real-time interrogation. The document contained factual errors, including Duke's birth date, which she corrected by hand and initialed. To critics, it looked less like a police record and more like a legal shield constructed after the conclusion had already been decided. 8 days after Eduardo Torella's death, headlines announced Doris Duke's $25,000 donation to restore Newport's Cliff Walk. Additional gifts followed to Newport Hospital and civic institutions. No court ever established a direct connection between these donations and the closure of the case, but many locals noticed the timing. 7 months later, Chief Radis retired on a modest salary. Within a few years, records showed he had purchased condominium units in Hollywood, Florida, where neighbors included individuals later identified in law enforcement documents as having organized crime connections. Officially, nothing was wrong, but the damage was done. Do you want me to continue to Part 5, covering the civil lawsuit, the shocking jury verdict, and how Eduardo Torrella's family was erased almost as thoroughly as the investigation itself, or would you like any adjustments before we move on? Part 5, Justice Measured in Pocket Change. 5 years after Eduardo Torrella was killed at the gates of Rough Point, his family turned to the only avenue still open to them: civil court. In 1971, Torrella's siblings filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Doris Duke, seeking $2.5 million. It was not revenge, it was recognition. An acknowledgement that a life had been taken and that the official story had failed to account for it. The courtroom quickly revealed the imbalance of power. Doris Duke arrived backed by elite attorneys whose strategy was not to explain what happened at Rough Point, but to diminish the man who died there. Eduardo Torrella's career was scrutinized. His personal life was dissected. His earning potential was questioned, despite his success in Hollywood and his 7 years as the trusted artistic authority over Duke's estates. Duke herself testified that she relied completely on Torrella's judgment for acquisitions worth millions of dollars. She acknowledged his central role in shaping her world. Yet, in the same breath, her legal team argued that his life held limited financial value. The jury deliberated. When the verdict was read, it stunned even seasoned observers: $75,000. That was the total amount awarded for Eduardo Torrella's death. Financial analysts later noted that the sum was less than Doris Duke earned in daily interest on her fortune. After legal fees were deducted, court records showed that each of Torrella's siblings received approximately $5,620. For a brother, for a life. She killed him twice, Torrella's niece, Donna Lomangino, would later say. First, she destroyed his body. Then she erased his worth. Doris Duke returned to her estates. The gates of Rough Point remained closed. The official ruling of accident stayed intact. In the years that followed, Duke expanded her public legacy. In 1968, she founded the Newport Restoration Foundation, purchasing and restoring more than 80 colonial-era buildings. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis served as vice president, lending social legitimacy to the project. Philanthropy became a shield. History became curated. Friends later claimed that Duke sometimes called members of the Torrella family in moments of distress. These accounts were never verified. What remained verifiable was the imbalance. Eduardo Torrella lay in Holy Cross Cemetery in North Arlington, New Jersey. Doris Duke continued to live among 5 estates. The case faded from headlines, but not from memory. Do you want me to continue to Part 6, covering Doris Duke's final years, the strange circumstances surrounding her own death, and the modern investigation that reopened old wounds decades later, or would you like any revisions before we proceed? Part 6. The silence breaks, but the verdict remains. As the decades passed, Doris Duke aged, but the machinery of her world stayed intact. Control never loosened. Relationships continued to fracture. Loyalty was temporary. Power was permanent. In 1988, at the age of 75, Doris Duke made a decision that baffled even those closest to her. She legally adopted an adult woman named Chandy Hefner, citing spiritual reasons. For a brief period, Hefner appeared to be positioned as heir. Then, just as suddenly, she was disinherited. Lawsuits followed. The pattern repeated. Trust extended. Trust revoked. In her final years, Duke's closest companion became her butler, Bernard Lafferty, hired in 1987. He managed her daily life, medications, and access to the outside world. As her health declined, questions began to surface. On October 28, 1993, Doris Duke died at the age of 80. A nurse later alleged that improper medication administration may have contributed to her death. An investigation was conducted. Officials concluded there was no credible evidence of wrongdoing. The irony was impossible to ignore. Duke's estate was valued at more than $1 billion. From it emerged the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, which would go on to distribute hundreds of millions of dollars to medical research, environmental causes, and the arts. Her name was preserved as a benefactor. Her past remained unresolved. For 54 years, the death of Eduardo Torella officially remained an accident. Then, in 2018, investigative journalist Peter Lance reopened the story. Lance had begun his career at the Newport Daily News only months after Torella's death. The case had never left him. His research culminated in a Vanity Fair article and the book Homicide at Rough Point. The work assembled decades of overlooked evidence, contradictions, and testimony that challenged the original ruling. The publication had consequences. In July 2021, Bob Walker, the 13-year-old newspaper boy who had witnessed the events at the gates, finally came forward. He gave a formal statement to Newport police, describing what he heard and saw that evening in 1966. Detective Jack West interviewed Walker for nearly 2 hours. According to police records, his account was initially deemed credible. But in November 2021, Newport police announced that the case would remain closed. Officials stated there was no new evidence sufficient to warrant further review. The gates of Rough Point still stand. Visitors pass through them today. The museum acknowledges the death, but continues to describe it as an accident. Eduardo Torella remains buried in Holy Cross Cemetery in North Arlington, New Jersey. October 7th, 1966 remains officially the date of an unfortunate accident. Whether history will ever call it something else remains unanswered. Do you want me to combine all parts into one complete TXT file for you? Or would you like a rewritten ending with a stronger hook for audience engagement?